Hello, I'm Russell Sturgis. I'm the founder and principal of EAP Mentor. Welcome to part 6 in the series that we've been doing on understanding mindfulness. And today we're looking at mindfulness and aging. The experience of aging is this idea that we go from birth to death, and we have this time frame in which how we experience life through our aspects of consciousness morphs. So, for example, the aspects of consciousness are primarily who we are physically, who we are mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so we have this idea that, for example, physically, it's quite obvious that we have this experience where our bodies get, we grow into adulthood, we eventually develop wrinkles, we have deterioration of tissues in the body, and eventually get to this place where we die. And so the physical presence sort of has a very clear beginning and end. And aging is the mechanism of going from birth through to death. We also get to experience this in terms of who we are mentally. And so with life and its experiences, we mature in our cognitive capacities, in our capacity to think and to reason, and we have this ability to hopefully have more wisdom in terms of how we approach our life. But once again, through the aging process, and particularly in more recent years, we've seen the development of Alzheimer's and dementia, where the capacity for the mind to function breaks down. And we have this situation where people have lost all of that amazing freedom and development that it was experienced in their thinking until such time as the aging process resulted in them having these diseases. In terms of who we are spiritually, once again, what we have is this the spirit in this context is about motivation. It's about our drivenness. And of course, once again, those of us who are getting on in years, we look back and we look at how much energy and drive and passion we had during our 30s and our 40s. And we started to see that wane off a bit in our 50s. And of course, in our society, in Western society, we have retirement. And so as people are getting into their 60s, there's this point where they retire, which is sort of admission of a lack of engagement or a redirection of energies into a more subtle way of living, I guess is a way that I would put it, so that we're not out there pushing ourselves and being driven. So once again, we see this shift in energy in our capacity to be able to do the things that we could do when we were younger, having been diluted substantially the older that we get. And of course, as we look at many of the people who get into their 80s and 90s, if they live that long, they're not very mobile, many of them, and they've lost that ability to be passionate about life. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some people who carry that right through into their 90s and are able to maintain that, but the majority of people don't. In terms of emotions, it's kind of interesting. It was quite common to hear the expression grumpy old men as they were getting older. As I reflected on what I saw in my own parents in particular, in both of my parents, there was a greater capacity to express love and to be more loving in their nature. And it's not that it wasn't expressed so much in younger years, but there was time and there was opportunity to be more expressive around those things. But once again, there's this morphing or greater understanding and connection with feeling. And so there is a greater capacity or potential for empathy and compassion and those qualities that oftentimes we're too busy and caught up in all the other aspects of our consciousness to really fully embrace as part of our experience. And so as we have more time to be present to our feelings, have more awareness around our feelings, then we have the capacity to identify what's going on in the lives of other people and to be more connected in terms of compassion and empathy in those regards. In what I just expressed, of course, and described in each of those four elements, there's just such a plethora of ways that they can be expressed. And of course, not all of them are expressed in the ways that I discussed. And they're probably more indicative of my experience and the things that I've been able to observe in terms of my parents and their generation. And now that I'm in my 60s, me and my generation. And so we have this process of evolution, morphing that takes place through our human journey. Now, there's three things that gather momentum with the process of aging, and these three things happen to us all. The first one of those is the concept of justice, in particular natural justice. And this is the idea, for example, of lifestyle disease. Lifestyle disease is essentially natural justice. It's the consequence of choices that we've made, habitual choices that we've made throughout our life that have resulted in the environments within our body in which disease is able to manifest. And so with the aging process, when we're young, we can eat all the sweets and be consuming refined carbohydrates and doing all of those things without any obvious impact, maybe obesity, and that's one of the things that we've seen is the impact of obesity. But in terms of diabetes, diabetes doesn't show up when you're in your 20s and 30s so much. It's when you start to get into your 40s and 50s and 60s that the consequence of a lifestyle, habitual lifestyle that was oriented towards the consumption of refined carbohydrates and sugars, etc., shows up in this disease that in its worst case scenario, with the progression of aging, can result in deterioration of the extremities, and it's not uncommon to see people losing limbs and having heart conditions and all sorts of things as a result of diabetes. But it's more than diabetes. It is heart disease. It's cancer. It's depression. There's a whole lot of these lifestyle diseases that have come off the back of living without awareness, living habitually, living in a way that has been programmed both through family and through culture and society. And so it's one of the things that we can't avoid. Now, we try to, and of course what we have is a huge progression in the development of medication, for example, and surgeries in order to compensate for that. But even then, they're stopgap measures. And so what we have is this impact in our lives that we can't avoid, and it's one of those things that comes with aging. The one that we talk about in the blog is the impact of time. and that we can't stop time. Now, there's many people who, through cryonics and all sorts of other things, have tried to win the battle against aging, and we have all of these products available on the market, and people literally spend millions of dollars collectively on trying to circumvent the impact of time on our bodies in terms of the way in which it's bringing about the change in our features, in our facial features, and in the quality of our skin and tissues. And of course, all of those things that we talked about, the breaking down of who we are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually with the progression of time. Can't stop it. And as I write about in terms of Petrarch, is that time eventually wins over all. Fame, wealth, power, love, all of those things that we aspire for within our process of engagement in human experience. Time eventually wins. And of course, what we can see is that in spite of the impact that certain people may have had at different times in humanity's progression, eventually even they had to succumb to the impact of time, and it was no longer sustainable in terms of what it was that they were trying to do. The other element that impacts on us is and once again, the longer we live, the more we are exposed to fortuna, turning the wheel of fortune. And so it's this whole idea that we go through these many cycles of ups and downs and roundabouts in terms of the times of success and times of failure, times of love and times of abandonment and loneliness, times of empowerment and times of victimhood. And it's like the wheel turns, and we keep on being exposed to this variety of things throughout our journey of life. And of course, the older we get, the more we're exposed to these things. The question has to be asked is it possible as we get older to avoid the exposure to justice, time and chance that we've had all throughout our human experience? Is it possible to come to a place where those things happen without causing suffering? And by the way, it's this concept of suffering that's brought about by these things has been referred to as the dark night of the senses. It's this idea that our sensory experience ends up in us having painful experiences or moments of suffering, and it seems that the older we get, the more sustainable the suffering is. And the evidence of that is that we see, particularly in our society today, an increase in the use of antidepressants, for example, recreational drugs, suicide, addictions in all of their varieties, where people are trying to avoid the suffering that is attached to the impact of justice, time and chance. There is a remedy, or there is an alternative, which is mindfulness. And if you remember, and we've been talking about this in this particular series, the Western mindfulness definition of mindfulness is remembering in each moment that you have a choice to be kinder to yourself, to others, and to the planet. Now, the ability to have a choice to be kinder comes off the back of having developed awareness of an alternative, a more loving alternative, which is having more knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And so what we do have is the capacity to be able to create a greater understanding of better serving choices for us and for others and for the planet, and to put ourselves into the position where we have the capacity to remember that we have a choice in terms of those loving alternatives. Now, as we develop a greater sense of these alternatives, what we're exposed to is a value system that's very different to the one that sits at the basis of our suffering. That value system is based on societal and familial concepts of what is deemed to be success or achievement in terms of power, in terms of wealth, in terms of love, and in terms of success or fame. And so we have a world where our values are oriented towards these things. As we stop and begin to consider loving alternatives, we begin to identify and explore a completely different set of values. And these values are include things like peace and unconditional love, agape style love. It embraces this idea of joy and awe. And so what ends up happening is that as we become more aware of these as being realities, and that we're able to choose our experiences of peace, love, joy, and awe over wealth, power, love, and fame, being in that position and remembering that we have a choice for that, what we have the capacity to do is to build new neural pathways around choosing behaviours in terms of how we turn up in the world physically, how we turn up emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, starts to be aligned with these sustainable values. And in that place, we're able to soften the aging experience. We're able to reduce the suffering in the aging experience. And in fact, we're able to bring grace to the experience of getting older. And ideally, we're able to lessen the impact of disease in all of its different expressions in our human experience. So there is a gentler way of approaching aging, and as I indicated, that gentler way is by being aligned with sustainable values, treasures of the heart that see us using our time and resources in a way that is better serving to our health and well-being. So ideally, you would want to learn and develop the capacity to do this in younger years. So, ideally, I would suggest that you don't live it to your 60s or 70s to start to consider these things, that maybe it's possible at a much earlier time to start to give consideration to sustainable values. Obviously, the earlier you can do it, the earlier you're actually creating a state of health and well-being. And in that place, you're able to sustain health and well-being all through the aging years, which means that the typical impact of aging that we see in our world today is less evident in someone who's had a lifestyle that's been oriented towards mindfulness and awareness. And so I would like you to consider that there is an alternative to suffering. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to explain that in terms of the Enhancers Awareness Program, what we do is help people to align their who they are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually with sustainable values. And we give people the tools to be able to develop the awareness of these values and to have the tools to practice living mindfully. Once again, remembering that mindfulness is having that capacity to recall in each moment that there's a loving alternative, that there's a healthier choice, and that you know what strategies are required to implement that. That's what we do at EAP, is to help you develop a life that is centered around loving awareness and mindfulness. And of course, as I said just a moment ago, what that does is gives the aging process a healthier and richer context. If you want to know more about EAP, please go to eapmentor.com, and please go to our Facebook page, Enhances Awareness Program, EAP Mentor, to find out more about different ways that you're able to approach simple things day to day. We have some really lovely insights and reminders being posted there on a regular basis that can help you to remember to live with awareness and mindfulness. And look forward to speaking to you again in our series on understanding mindfulness. See you later. Bye.